document be noted. The member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak to the report tabled by the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Standing Committee and their inquiry into family, domestic and sexual violence. I thank the committee members, particularly the chair, the member for Fisher, for guiding what must have been a very difficult and emotional inquiry. I thank the 298 individuals and organisations who took the time to make submissions to the inquiry, and in particular all of those who appeared at the 16 public hearings. No doubt some of the experiences were incredibly traumatic for those hearing, but also those telling, and I commend you for your strength and courage, and I really hope your contributions will help inform us as decision makers and assist other victim survivors in getting the support and assistance they need. I thank the Secretariat for their assistance and professionalism in supporting this vital inquiry. The report is extremely thorough and detailed with 88 recommendations. And my hope, though, is that the report is actioned, not just actioned, but prioritised. Too often, committees, witnesses, expert organisations, Secretariat staff commit a great deal of time, resources and energy into these inquiries that produce well-researched reports with a list of much-needed recommendations, but unfortunately they sit idle. So I call on the government to carefully consider the full list of 88 recommendations made in the report, and particularly as they draft the new national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. The reality is that in this place, we're acutely aware of the scourge of family, domestic and sexual violence. As community leaders, we sadly see it in our neighbourhoods. We work with the shelters and the charities supporting the victims. We attend vigils, we send condolences and we post about thoughts and prayers. But what action are we taking in this place to really address the issue? As the Chair highlighted in the foreword, in Australia, on average, one woman dies every 8 days, making it statistically likely that over the duration of this inquiry alone, 40 Australian women would have lost their lives at the hands of a current or former partner. That is a shameful statistic and it cries out for action. We should note the origin of the inquiry, which was in fact an embarrassment in itself, where we had a complete failure by a Senate inquiry that was supposed to be into domestic violence, wrapped up 3 months early, having not taken any submissions or held any public hearings. It was the public outcry that led to this inquiry being put in place. So I commend the government for their response back in June to establish this inquiry with the House Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs. Terms of reference covered a range of areas and specifically designed to inform the next national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. And I was particularly pleased to see reference to examination of all forms of violence against women, including, but not limited to, coercive control and technology-facilitated abuse. There were 88 recommendations, and as the Chair has highlighted, they're grouped into 5 key themes. The next National Action Plan to reduce violence against women and their children should involve a more uniform approach across jurisdictions, and one that is more inclusive of the various manifestations of family violence. This should include the development of a uniform national definition of family, domestic and sexual violence that takes into account the non-physical forms of violence, such as coercive control, financial and technology-facilitated abuse. Then 2, the national plan must seek to engender a culture of accountability and greater workforce support, and that all Australian governments should work collaboratively and transparently and be held to account through quantitative targets. It needs to be measurable. Education is critical, thirdly. There remains a need for greater awareness and understanding of the many forms of family, domestic and sexual violence, the causes and impacts of violence and the ways in which it can be prevented. Fourthly, that in response to a family, domestic and sexual violence, the welfare of victim survivors and their children should be paramount. The next national plan should seek to improve victim survivors' access to specialist services, as well as housing, legal aid and financial assistance. And finally, fifth, that the next national plan must continue to hold perpetrators to account for their use of violence. This should include increased penalties for breaches of domestic violence orders and improved information sharing about perpetrators. I strongly support greater deterrence through harsher penalties. I am astounded and I'm quite outraged by this aspect. I contrast the response that we have to domestic violence to, for example, the response implemented at state level by state governments to the spate of one-punch attacks, which we saw in New Sydney, for example, in King's Cross. We saw entire industries shut down with the introduction of controversial lockout laws. I note Victorian and Queensland governments have also introduced specific legislation in regards to coward punch attacks. So a one-punch attack, predominantly a male-on-male assault, has mobilised state governments to implement harsher sentencing and stricter liability laws. But domestic violence, where one woman is killed on average every 8 days, has not done the same. We have domestic violence, we fail to attract anywhere near the same sense of outrage, censor and legislative action. Between the year 2000 and 2016, there's been a total of 127 deaths from coward punch attacks. In contrast, the accepted statistic is that one woman dies every 8 days at the hands of a current or former partner. So I've done the math. In the same period, we have had 127 coward punch attacks, and at the same time 730 women, daughters, sisters, wives, mothers and aunts have been slain, but no action. The statistics are even more horrific. So even when found guilty, only about 16% of perpetrators will face a custodial sentence, and the average length of incarceration is 370 days for the most serious kinds of assault. And on top of that, only 1.5% of perpetrators will complete the full sentence in custody. That is outrageous. And it is so symptomatic that because this is an act of violence, when we're talking about intimate partner violence, that it is involving the victims are women, we are completely failing to have that same sense of urgency to act and put in place strong deterrence measures. I do not accept that we can have harsher laws in relation to coward punch attacks with mandatory minimum sentencing regimes. Why on earth do we not have a similar regime for intimate partner violence? It must change. The point of legislation is deterrence, and we must send a clear and strong message to society and perpetrators that they will face significant minimum mandatory sentences. I truly hope the government can take on the integrated and holistic approach of implementing all the recommendations, but in particular the recommendation to look at strengthening sentencing. I was pleased to see in the budget release yesterday nearly $1 billion over 4 years for initiatives to reduce and support the victims of family, domestic and sexual violence against women and children. And I welcome the increase from $150 million announced in the COVID response package in March last year. The budget papers note that violence against women is estimated to cost Australia $26 billion annually. So while money certainly can't fix everything, $250 million a year to fix a $26 billion problem seems like a very small investment and way to address the issue. So whilst I commend the government for addressing it, it's clear that a lot more needs to be done. The family law system needs reform, but from my experience, the courts and on the Family Law Committee inquiry, funding is a major problem to ensure access to justice and appropriate protection. We need to do more in that respect, and I note some funding was provided to that system as well. We cannot have a proper conversation about addressing domestic and family violence without the honest discussion of broader cultural change, and for that we need to make sure respect for women, respect for all, is above and beyond all else. And there are many actions in this place where we've failed to uphold that standard, and that needs to change. Leadership is important. We will only get cultural change if it comes from the top, and it must come from this place. We must determine what is that standard that we simply will not allow to drop. We have to raise the standard. We have people in this place that have behaved appallingly. That needs to stop. We have to act on intimate partner violence.